A 2-year-old girl vanishes in 4 minutes. 9 years later, a DNA match in a federal lab threatens to unravel everything. This is the story of Zoe Harris, and what you're about to hear will change how you think about cold cases forever. Before we dive into this shocking true story, if you love deep dives into unsolved mysteries and the relentless pursuit of justice, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Here at the Cold Case Desk, we bring you the cases that refuse to stay buried. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail of what's coming. A quiet September morning in the year 2000 began with an unusual alert sounding in a federal lab in Philadelphia. 2 investigators froze the moment a missing child identifier flashed on the screen, matching a case thought to have been dormant for nearly 9 years in Wilmington, Delaware. Not far away, residents in a suburban neighborhood glanced at each other through curtains as vehicles from the cold case unit quietly pulled up to the precinct, where officers were gathering documents forgotten since the early 1990s. Inside the office, Detective Sarah Donnelly, long accustomed to handling long-term missing persons cases, stood motionless for a few seconds in front of the file labeled Zoe Harris, the 2-year-old who vanished in just 4 minutes from her front yard. A notification had just come in. A DNA sample from an unidentified girl in New Jersey was a perfect match to the 1991 profile, and Donnelly instantly understood that this moment could reopen a door many believed would never see light again. But to understand how we got here, to this moment in September 2000, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to a morning that started like any other in Wilmington, Delaware, but would end in a way that no one could have imagined. In 1991, Wilmington, Delaware was still a typical quiet community in the northeastern United States. Narrow streets lined with 2-story homes, neatly trimmed lawns, children playing on porches, and neighbors who knew each other's faces. In an era before Amber Alerts, and with surveillance cameras rare, people believed bad things rarely happened where they lived. It was a different time, a time when parents felt safe letting their children play in the front yard, a time when a quick trip inside to answer the phone didn't feel like a risk. The Harris family blended perfectly into that calm. Michael Harris was a steady, reserved electrical technician, the kind of man who kept to himself, but was always willing to help a neighbor fix a broken wire or troubleshoot an outlet. He worked long hours, but always made time for his family. Laura Harris was a careful, devoted elementary school teacher at the local primary school. She was known for her patience, her attention to detail, and her genuine love for children. Michael and Laura poured all their attention into their little daughter, Zoe. Zoe was just 2 years old, with lightly curly brown hair that caught the sunlight, bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, and a curious but clingy personality. She wasn't the type of child who wandered off. In fact, she rarely left her mother's side. To the neighbors, Zoe was a friendly child, often brought out by Laura to play in the front yard each morning when the weather was nice. She had a distinctive laugh, a little giggle that could be heard down the street. People who lived on Talleyrand Drive would later say they could set their watches by Laura and Zoe's morning routine. The morning of the incident unfolded normally. It was early September, and the weather had just begun to shift from summer heat to autumn coolness. The kind of morning where the air feels fresh, and the light has that golden quality that makes everything seem peaceful. Michael was in the garage fixing tools, working on some electrical equipment he'd brought home from a job site. Laura was cleaning the kitchen, wiping down counters, and organizing the morning dishes, and then took Zoe out front to enjoy the cool air. The neighborhood was peaceful, with only the sound of raking leaves and a few kids riding bikes past. A typical suburban morning. The kind of morning where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But amid that familiarity, one small but out-of-place detail appeared. A green sedan driving slowly through the area, pausing for a moment before moving on. Several neighbors would later mention this vehicle. Some said it had been driving through the neighborhood multiple times that morning. Others remembered seeing it parked at the corner for several minutes. And then there was the figure of a stranger standing at the corner, watching several times that morning. A person who didn't belong. Someone no one recognized. Laura noticed briefly, but didn't see it as a threat since the area rarely had any trouble. This was Wilmington. This was her neighborhood. These were her neighbors. What could possibly go wrong? When the landline phone rang inside, Laura made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She placed Zoe in the stroller right in front of the steps, as she always did when she had to look away for a short time. The stroller was positioned directly in front of the house, visible from the front window. It was maybe 10 feet from the door. Laura could hear if Zoe cried out. She could be back outside in seconds. She went inside to answer the call, only a few meters from her daughter. The phone was in the kitchen, and from where it hung on the wall, Laura could almost see the front yard through the window. Almost. That interval lasted only about 4 minutes. 4 minutes. 240 seconds. The length of a typical song on the radio. The time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. 4 minutes that would change everything. The phone call itself was unremarkable. A colleague from the school asking about lesson plans for the upcoming week. Laura answered questions, confirmed a few details, and hung up. She remembers checking the clock on the kitchen wall. She remembers thinking she needed to get back outside to Zoe. She remembers walking to the front door, pushing it open, and stepping onto the porch. And that's when her world shattered. When Laura returned, the scene before her was completely wrong. The stroller was turned sideways toward the gate. The gate was ajar, though it had been closed. She was certain it had been closed. She always made sure the gate was closed when Zoe was outside. And the space where Zoe had just been sitting was now completely empty. No crying. No sound of little feet running away. No sign Zoe had wandered off on her own. Just a sudden emptiness, as if someone had swiftly taken the child without leaving a sound. The silence was the worst part. If Zoe had fallen, she would have cried. If she'd climbed out of the stroller, Laura would have heard the familiar sound of her trying to navigate the straps. But there was nothing. Just silence and an empty stroller. Laura's first thought was that she was confused, that maybe Zoe had climbed out and was hiding. Children do that sometimes, right? They think it's a game, she called out, her voice still calm, still controlled. Zoe, honey, where are you? Zoe? Nothing. Laura rushed into the yard, calling her daughter's name, her voice growing louder, more desperate with each repetition. She ran along the walkway and into neighboring yards, checking behind bushes, looking under the porch, calling Zoe's name over and over. Zoe, Zoe, baby, where are you? This isn't funny. Come out right now. Michael heard the panic in his wife's voice. It was a sound he'd never heard before, a primal fear that cut through the quiet morning like a siren. He immediately left the garage, tools still in hand, and joined the search. Within minutes, they scoured the entire area around the house, under the car, behind bushes, along the side of the house, in the backyard, inside the garage, back inside the house, checking closets and under beds, even though they both knew Zoe couldn't have gotten inside without them seeing her. But there was no trace Zoe had moved anywhere. No small footprints in the damp soil of the garden beds. No toys dropped along a path. No sign of her at all. Neighbors began to help. Word spread quickly down Talleyrand Drive. A child was missing. Everyone needed to help look. Within 20 minutes, at least a dozen people were searching. But the information each person offered was vague and inconsistent. One boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, said he saw Zoe walking with a woman. He described the woman as wearing light-colored clothing, but couldn't remember her face or hair color or anything else useful. An elderly person vaguely remembered someone carrying something quickly toward the end of the street. They weren't even sure if it was a person carrying something or someone carrying a bag or just someone walking quickly. The memory was fuzzy, uncertain. Another neighbor thought the green car from earlier had made an odd U-turn. They remembered because it seemed strange. The car had been driving slowly, almost too slowly, and then it suddenly turned around and left the neighborhood at a normal speed. The scattered fragments couldn't be pieced together into any solid search direction. Every piece of information seemed to contradict another. The woman was wearing light colors. No, someone else said. It was dark clothing. The car was green. Or was it blue? Was there even a car involved? Time ticked by, turning initial calm into panic. Michael ran to the end of the street, looking for clues, asking anyone he passed if they'd seen a little girl. Laura desperately knocked on every neighbor's door, but no one had seen Zoe anywhere within several hundred meters of the house. Every simple possibility, like a toddler wandering off, was ruled out when all hope of finding her themselves vanished and fear became suffocating. By now, nearly 30 minutes had passed since Laura had come back outside to find the empty stroller. 30 minutes without any sign of her daughter. 30 minutes of searching and calling and praying and hoping and finding nothing. Laura returned to the kitchen phone, hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. Her fingers kept slipping on the buttons. She had to start over twice. In gasping breaths and utter despair, the Harris family reported to 911 that their 2-year-old daughter had disappeared from the front yard in just a few short minutes. The dispatcher's calm voice on the other end asked questions. What was the child wearing? When did you last see her? Has she ever wandered off before? Laura answered as best she could, but her voice kept breaking, and she had to stop to breathe, to try to stay calm enough to give the information. This call officially marked the start of the Zoe Harris missing person case, and from this moment forward, nothing in Wilmington, Delaware would be the same. Immediately after Laura Harris's call was routed to the emergency dispatch center, Wilmington's 911 system classified it as a high-risk missing child and dispatched the nearest patrol units to the address on Talleyrand Drive. The classification was important. High risk meant immediate response. It meant every available unit in the area would be notified. It meant this took priority over almost everything else. Minutes later, 2 Wilmington PD patrol cars stopped in front of the Harris home, their roof lights still spinning softly, shattering the neighborhood's usual silence. The sight of police cars on Talleyrand Drive drew more neighbors out of their homes. People stood on porches, watching, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. Officers quickly secured the scene, noting the family's panicked state and the disturbance in the front yard. They prioritized establishing a perimeter by dividing the area into 3 control zones: the front yard and porch, the 3 adjacent houses, and the main road leading out of the street. One officer immediately restricted access to the front yard to avoid further contaminating evidence, while others began collecting initial witness statements from those present. However, the scene had already been significantly disturbed by the family's and neighbors' earlier frantic search. Footprints were mixed on the ground. Dozens of people had walked through the yard in the past 35 minutes. The stroller's position had been moved. Michael had grabbed it at one point, looking underneath, checking to see if somehow Zoe had fallen under it, even though that made no sense. And any critical marks were no longer in their original state. The officers could see that immediately. One of them, a veteran with nearly 15 years on the force, shook his head slightly. He knew that evidence had been lost in those first crucial minutes, but he also understood why. Any parent would have done the same thing. Police could only document the existence of those traces rather than their exact condition at the moment of disappearance. They took photographs of the yard, the stroller, the gate, the street. They made sketches of where things were positioned. But they all knew this was documentation after the fact, not documentation of the actual crime scene. Laura and Michael Harris were separated and interviewed by different officers. This was standard procedure. It wasn't because police suspected them, though in any missing child case, parents are always looked at first. It was to get independent accounts, to see if their stories matched, to gather as much detail as possible. Laura provided details about the time she'd looked away from Zoe. She described Zoe's clothing, a pink t-shirt with a small flower on the front, denim overalls, white sneakers with Velcro straps, no jacket because the morning was warm. She described Zoe's belongings, a small stuffed rabbit that Zoe carried everywhere. It was still in the stroller. Whatever happened so fast that Zoe didn't even have time to grab her rabbit. Laura described what she saw when she stepped back outside. The turned stroller, the open gate, the emptiness. She kept repeating that detail. It was just empty. She was just gone. Michael corroborated everything. He'd been in the garage. He'd heard Laura's voice change from calling to panicking. He'd run out and seen the empty stroller and known immediately that something was terribly wrong. Simultaneously, police compiled an initial witness list, prioritizing those closest to the scene at the time of the incident. They went door to door, taking names, addresses, phone numbers. They asked everyone the same questions. Where were you between 9:30 and 10 o'clock this morning? Did you see anything unusual? Did you see the Harris child? Did you see anyone you didn't recognize in the neighborhood? Though there were many witnesses, their statements conflicted. Some described a woman's figure. Medium height, they said, or maybe tall. Light hair, or possibly wearing a hat. Moving quickly down the street, or maybe walking normally. Others thought they saw something being carried toward the end of the street. A bundle, one person called it. Something wrapped in fabric. But they couldn't be sure what it was. And some insisted they had seen the green car driving slowly before disappearing. A sedan, they agreed. Green, definitely green. Or maybe dark blue. 4 doors, or possibly 2 doors. No one had gotten a license plate number. Each piece of information had potential value, but contradicted the others, making it hard to establish a clear investigative direction. Officers had to assess reliability based on vantage point, witness age, and timing of observation. The 10-year-old boy who said he saw Zoe walking with a woman had been playing in his yard, fairly close to the Harris house. But he'd been focused on his toys, looking up only occasionally. The elderly person who remembered someone carrying something had been looking out a window from across the street. Their eyesight wasn't great. They admitted they couldn't be certain of what they'd seen. The witnesses who mentioned the green car were more confident, but there were 3 different descriptions of the vehicle. While analyzing statements, another team searched the surrounding area to determine whether Zoe could have left the yard on her own. They walked the streets in expanding circles from the Harris home. They checked yards, alleys, spaces between houses. They looked for anywhere a small child might have wandered or hidden. They checked storm drains, though they hated doing it. They looked in dumpsters behind the shopping center 2 blocks away. They searched a small wooded area at the edge of the neighborhood, but they found no evidence she had moved independently, no sign of her at all. That allowed police to quickly rule out the lost child theory and shift focus to abduction by 1 or more persons. This wasn't a case of a curious toddler wandering off. This was something else, something much worse. The next step was to pinpoint the exact disappearance window. Officers interviewed Laura multiple times, asking her to recall every detail of the phone call. When did it ring? How long did you talk? Are you certain about the time? Laura was certain, from the moment she left the yard to answer the phone until she returned and discovered Zoe gone. She estimated about 4 minutes, maybe 5 at the most. The phone records would later confirm this. The call had lasted 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Add in the time it took Laura to walk inside, answer the phone, and walk back outside, and police estimated the critical time frame was 3 to 5 minutes. In that extremely brief period, the perpetrator had to approach, take Zoe, and leave the scene without making significant noise. Think about that for a moment. 3 to 5 minutes. The perpetrator had to walk up to the yard, possibly open the gate, reach the stroller, take Zoe out of it, carry her away, and leave the area. All without Zoe crying out. All without any neighbors noticing something clearly wrong. All in less time than it takes to make a piece of toast. This time frame became the investigation's core, helping authorities narrow possible actions and eliminate unrealistic scenarios. It meant the perpetrator couldn't have been on foot, not if they wanted to get far enough away to avoid the immediate search. It meant they had to have a vehicle nearby. It meant they had to work quickly and confidently. And it meant, most disturbingly, that they had to have known they would have this window. Had they been watching the Harris house? Did they know Laura's routine? Did they wait for the phone to ring? Confirming the front gate, which Laura insisted had been closed before she went inside, but was found ajar when she returned, became a key detail, suggesting deliberate approach. The gate had a simple latch, nothing complicated. A child couldn't have opened it from inside the yard, but an adult could have opened it silently in seconds. The fact that it was open when Laura came back outside told investigators that someone had entered the yard on purpose. The green car mentioned by multiple witnesses was noted for a separate verification line. Officers began checking with the Department of Motor Vehicles, looking for green sedans registered in Delaware and surrounding states. It was a massive undertaking. There were thousands of green sedans, but it was a lead, and they had to follow it. After completing the initial assessment, Wilmington PD concluded this was beyond a routine missing child search. Preliminary findings indicated intent, speed, and preparation consistent with known child abduction patterns in neighboring states. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there had been several high-profile child abduction cases in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. Patterns were emerging. Children taken quickly from their own yards or neighborhoods, no witnesses, few clues. And in most cases, the children were never seen again. They immediately requested assistance from Delaware State Police to escalate the investigation. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Calling in the state police meant admitting that the local department needed help. It meant bringing in more resources, more personnel, more expertise. But it also meant the case would be taken more seriously at a higher level. Once the report and all preliminary information were forwarded to the state level, the Zoe Harris case was officially taken over by DSP. This meant a senior detective would be assigned as lead. The case was quickly handed to Detective Clarence Doyle, a man with nearly 20 years of experience in child disappearances and a reputation for being skilled at coordinating multiple units. Doyle was in his late 40s, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd worked on some of the most difficult cases in Delaware's history. He'd found missing children. He'd also worked cases where the children were never found. He knew what he was walking into. Doyle's arrival marked the shift from chaotic initial response to organized investigation with clear strategy and stricter protocols. When he pulled up to the Harris home just after noon on that September day, he didn't rush. He sat in his car for a moment, reading through the initial reports that had been radioed to him on the drive over. He wanted to understand what he was dealing with before he stepped into the chaos. Doyle arrived at the scene shortly after assignment, reviewed all first-hour findings, assessed each piece of information's reliability, and began building appropriate investigative avenues. He walked through the yard slowly, his eyes taking in everything. The position of the stroller, the gate, the street beyond. He knelt down and looked at the ground, noting the disturbed soil, the mixed footprints. He stood at different vantage points, trying to see what neighbors might have seen. From this point, the Zoe Harris disappearance officially entered its intensive investigation phase, with both local and state forces involved. By late afternoon, there were more than 30 officers working the case. Some were still canvassing the neighborhood. Others were reviewing the witness statements. A team had been dispatched to check traffic cameras, though there weren't many in 1991. Another team was coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions, putting out alerts, making sure every police department in the region knew about Zoe Harris. Doyle continued observing the Harris front yard after reviewing all initial reports, then ordered the crime scene team to conduct a more precise forensic sweep to recover any usable traces. The crime scene unit arrived with their equipment, their cameras, their collection kits. They worked methodically, even though they knew the scene had been compromised. The already disturbed space was divided into smaller grids to minimize further trampling and allow systematic evaluation of each point. They used string and stakes to mark off sections of the yard, numbering each grid, photographing each one individually before anyone walked through it. Compressed soil near the gate became the focus, as it was the likely entry and exit path. This was where the perpetrator would have walked. This was where evidence might still exist. One adult shoe print remained clearer than others, despite contamination, showing a quick pivot and a lean toward the gate. The print was partial, not complete, but it was enough. It showed a pattern on the sole. It showed size. The impression in the soil showed weight distribution. The technician who found it carefully photographed it from multiple angles, then made a casting of it using dental plaster. It would take hours to set properly, but it was worth the wait. Near the curb, a narrow tire impression matched the type of vehicle witnesses had mentioned. Again, not perfect. Dozens of cars had driven down this street in the hours since Zoe disappeared. But there was one impression that looked different from the others. Deeper on one side, suggesting the vehicle had stopped quickly or was carrying extra weight. The tread pattern was photographed and documented. Meanwhile, Zoe's stroller was carefully moved to the porch for closer examination. The technicians dusted it for fingerprints first, though they found mostly smudged partial prints from Laura, Michael, and Zoe herself. But then, as they examined the wheels more closely, they found something. A beige fabric fiber caught on the wheel edge, something that belonged to none of the family's clothing. Laura was shown the fiber and asked if she recognized it. She shook her head. She'd never seen it before. It was collected carefully, placed in an evidence bag, and labeled. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was evidence that someone else had been near that stroller. From these signs, Doyle ordered a reconstruction of the suspect's approach. He had officers role-play the abduction based on the physical evidence. One officer played the perpetrator. Another played Zoe. They timed it. They tested different approaches. They looked at sight lines from neighboring houses. The most logical path started at the gate, went straight to the stroller, lifted Zoe, then exited by pivoting and following the shoe print direction, aligning with the tire mark. When they timed this sequence, it took between 90 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on how quickly the person moved. The speed of this sequence explained the lack of unusual noise and why no one noticed until Laura returned. If someone moved confidently and quickly, if they knew exactly what they were doing, they could be in and out of that yard in under 2 minutes. Add another minute or two to get to a vehicle and drive away, and you're still within that 3 to 5 minute window. Using footprint angle, soil compression, and stroller displacement, the team simulated the perpetrator's movements, confirming the suspect was likely right-handed when lifting Zoe and used the left hand to push the gate. The shoe print showed a pivot to the right. The gate showed finger marks on the left side. These small details built a picture, not of a face or a name, but of movements, of someone who knew what they were doing. These factors suggested the perpetrator was not impulsive, but calm and confident enough to act in a very short window without drawing neighbors' attention. This wasn't someone who panicked or rushed. This was someone who had a plan and executed it perfectly. Evidence analysis under 1991 technology focused on physical characteristics. DNA analysis was still relatively new and not widely used in criminal investigations. There was no DNA database to compare against, so the beige fiber was examined microscopically for material and possible garment type. The lab determined it was cotton blend, possibly from a jacket or sweater. Common fabric, nothing distinctive. The shoe print was compared to common sole patterns. They determined it was from a men's athletic shoe, probably size 10 or 11. A popular brand sold in stores across the country. Again, not distinctive enough to narrow down suspects, but useful information. And the tire mark was matched against standard sedan tire sizes. The pattern matched several different brands of tire commonly used on mid-size sedans. The wear pattern suggested the tires weren't new, but weren't completely worn out either. More information for the growing file, but nothing that pointed to a specific vehicle. Though no specific individual could yet be identified, the data eliminated many wrong theories and strengthened the focus on the suspicious vehicle. It wasn't a random stranger who happened to be walking by. It was someone with a vehicle who had come to this neighborhood with a purpose. To find more physical evidence, Doyle expanded the search to 3 directions: the roadside strip where the suspect vehicle may have stopped, the opposite curb where small items might have been dropped, and the stretch leading to the main road where matching tire marks might exist. Teams were deployed to scan every square meter, check under parked cars, and document any similar tire traces. They found some curb deformations that might have been from a vehicle stopping quickly. They found a few more partial tire impressions on the street leading out of the neighborhood. They collected cigarette butts, candy wrappers, a lost mitten, a broken toy car, and dozens of other items that probably had nothing to do with the case, but had to be collected anyway. Each item was documented, photographed, bagged, and labeled. Some curb deformations were noted, but not conclusive. The street was old, and there were marks from years of vehicles parking and driving. Without knowing exactly which marks were fresh from that morning, it was impossible to say for certain which were related to Zoe's abduction. Overall results showed the vehicle left via the only route to the main road, reinforcing that the perpetrator had planned a safe escape. There was really only one way out of the neighborhood quickly. Talleyrand Drive connected to a larger road that led to the highway. If you wanted to disappear fast, that's the route you'd take, and that's almost certainly what the perpetrator did. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Your engagement helps us bring more cases like this to light, and it reminds us that Zoe Harris and families like hers are never forgotten. Keep watching, because what happens next will leave you speechless. As the first day of the investigation drew to a close, Detective Doyle stood in the Incident Command Center that had been set up at the Wilmington Police Department. Maps covered the walls, showing the neighborhood, the surrounding areas, possible escape routes. Photographs of Zoe were pinned up everywhere. Her bright blue eyes and curly brown hair smiled out from dozens of copies of her most recent photo, taken just a week earlier at a family barbecue. A timeline had been constructed on a large whiteboard. 9:25 a.m. Laura takes Zoe outside. 9:30 a.m. Phone rings. 9:34 a.m. Laura returns outside. Zoe is gone. 9:36 a.m. Search begins. 9:48 a.m. 911 call. The narrow window of the abduction was marked in red. Below the timeline, they'd listed every piece of information they had: the green sedan, the possible sighting of a woman, the shoe print, the tire marks, the beige fiber. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Doyle knew that the next 24 to 48 hours were critical. Statistics showed that if a child wasn't found within the first 2 days, the chances of finding them alive dropped dramatically. He'd already ordered roadblocks on major highways. Every officer in the region had been given Zoe's description and photograph. The media had been contacted, and by the evening news, Zoe Harris's face would be on every television screen in Delaware and the surrounding states. The Harris family had been moved to a relative's house. Their home was now a crime scene, and they couldn't stay there while the investigation continued. Laura was sedated by a doctor, unable to cope with the shock. Michael sat silent, staring at nothing, blaming himself for being in the garage, for not being there, for not protecting his daughter. By nightfall on that first day, over 100 officers and volunteers were involved in the search. They walked through wooded areas with flashlights. They checked abandoned buildings. They knocked on doors of known sex offenders in the region. They followed up on every tip that came in, no matter how unlikely. But Zoe Harris remained missing. Day 2 began with an expanded search area. Doyle made the decision to widen the search radius to 50 miles. If the perpetrator had a vehicle and 5 minutes head start, they could be anywhere. Helicopters were brought in to search from the air. Dive teams were put on standby in case they needed to search any bodies of water. The media coverage intensified. Zoe's face was now on the front page of every newspaper. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with updates. A tip line was established, and within hours, it was overwhelmed with calls. Most were well-meaning but unhelpful. Someone thought they saw a child matching Zoe's description at a shopping mall 30 miles away. But when officers responded, it turned out to be someone else's child. Another caller claimed they'd seen the green sedan, but couldn't provide any details that weren't already known. A few tips were more disturbing. People claiming they knew what happened to Zoe. People claiming they had her and would return her for ransom. Each of these tips had to be investigated carefully. Doyle assigned specific detectives to handle potential ransom situations. They set up equipment to trace calls. They prepared protocols for if a credible ransom demand came through. But none of them were credible. They were cruel hoaxes or delusional individuals who had nothing to do with Zoe's disappearance. The investigation began to focus more heavily on the profile of the perpetrator. Doyle brought in an FBI profiler who specialized in child abductions. Together, they built a picture based on the evidence and the circumstances. The perpetrator was likely male, based on the shoe print size and the strength required to quickly lift a child and carry her away. Probably between 25 and 45 years old. Someone organized and patient enough to watch the Harris house and wait for an opportunity. Someone who knew the neighborhood or had been there before. The speed and confidence of the abduction suggested this might not be the first time. They checked national databases for similar abductions. They found 3 cases in neighboring states over the past 5 years that had similar patterns. Quick abductions from residential areas, children around Zoe's age, no witnesses, no ransom demands. And in 2 of those cases, the children had never been found. This was the nightmare scenario. A serial child abductor. Someone who took children not for ransom, not for any understandable reason, but for reasons Doyle didn't want to think about. Interviews with the Harris family continued. Police had to ask difficult questions. Were there any disputes with neighbors? Had anyone shown unusual interest in Zoe? Had Laura or Michael noticed anyone watching their house? The answers were all no. The Harrises were a normal, quiet family. They had no enemies. No one had threatened them. No one had shown any inappropriate interest in their daughter. Background checks on everyone in the neighborhood were conducted. This was standard procedure, but it was also invasive and uncomfortable. Neighbors who had helped search for Zoe now found police officers asking about their whereabouts that morning, about their criminal history, about whether they'd ever been accused of anything involving children. A few people had minor criminal records, traffic violations, a bar fight years ago, a shoplifting charge. Nothing that suggested involvement in child abduction. One name did raise a flag. A man living 4 houses down from the Harrises had been arrested 8 years earlier on an indecent exposure charge. He'd been caught exposing himself to adult women in a park. He'd been given probation and required to attend counseling. Doyle immediately ordered a full investigation into this individual. The man's name was Gerald Finch. He was 41 years old, unmarried, worked as a warehouse supervisor. He lived alone. When officers arrived to interview him, he was cooperative, but nervous. He'd been at work on the morning Zoe disappeared. His supervisor and 3 co-workers confirmed this. He'd clocked in at 7 a.m. and hadn't left until his lunch break at noon, well after Zoe was already gone. Security footage from the warehouse showed him working throughout the morning. His alibi was solid. But Doyle ordered a search of his house anyway. They needed to eliminate him completely. The search turned up nothing related to Zoe or any other children. No evidence of any crimes at all. Gerald Finch was cleared, but his name remained in the file. By the end of day 3, the investigation had reached a critical point. Despite hundreds of man-hours, despite following up every lead, despite searching an ever-widening area, there was no sign of Zoe Harris. She had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The only evidence they had was a shoe print, a tire mark, and a beige fiber. And the memory of a green sedan that multiple witnesses had seen, but no one could identify. Doyle knew what this meant. The chances of finding Zoe alive were shrinking with every hour. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He increased patrols in the neighborhood. He had officers interview everyone again, hoping someone would remember something new. He reviewed security footage from every store, gas station, and traffic camera within 100 miles. He contacted police departments in surrounding states, asking them to be alert for any sign of Zoe. The media coverage began to shift. The initial hope that Zoe would be found quickly was fading. Now reporters were using words like tragic and mysterious. They were interviewing child safety experts about how to protect children. They were comparing Zoe's case to other high-profile child abductions. And they were asking the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. Is Zoe Harris still alive? Laura Harris appeared on television, pleading for her daughter's return. She sat beside Michael, both of them looking hollow and exhausted, and spoke directly to whoever had taken Zoe. "Please," Laura said, her voice breaking. "Please bring her home. We just want her back. We won't press charges. We won't do anything. Just bring her home." The image of Laura's tear-stained face became iconic in the Delaware area. It ran on every news broadcast. It was printed in every newspaper. And it broke the hearts of everyone who saw it. But there was no response. No one came forward. No one called with information that led anywhere. Zoe remained missing. 1 week after the abduction, the physical search began to wind down. They'd searched everywhere they could think to search. They'd followed up every lead that had any merit. Doyle made the difficult decision to shift the investigation from active search to long-term missing persons case. This didn't mean they were giving up. It meant they were accepting reality. They didn't know where Zoe was. They didn't know who took her. And without new information, there was nowhere left to look. The case remained open. Doyle assigned 2 detectives to continue working at full time. Tips were still coming in, though less frequently now. Each one was still investigated. The Harris family's phone was still being monitored in case someone called. Laura and Michael had moved back into their house, though Laura could barely walk through the front yard without breaking down. Months passed. The media coverage dwindled. Other stories took precedence. The initial shock and horror of the community began to fade, not because people stopped caring, but because life demanded they move forward. Children still went to school. People still went to work. The world kept turning, even though for Laura and Michael Harris, It had stopped on that September morning. By the end of 1991, the Zoe Harris case was effectively cold. There were no active leads, no new evidence, no witnesses coming forward with new information. The file remained open, but realistically, everyone involved knew that without a break, without some unexpected piece of information, Zoe would never be found. Detective Doyle transferred to another unit after 2 years, but he never forgot the case. He kept a copy of Zoe's photograph on his desk. He would occasionally pull out the file and review it, hoping to see something he'd missed before. But there was nothing. Just dead ends and unanswered questions. The Harris family tried to rebuild their lives. Laura eventually returned to teaching, though she was never quite the same. Michael continued working as an electrician. They stayed in their house on Talleyrand Drive, unable to leave the place where they'd last seen their daughter. They held out hope in the way that parents of missing children always do. Hope that Zoe was alive somewhere. Hope that somehow, someday, she would come home. Years passed. 1992 became 1993. 1993 became 1994. The case file gathered dust in the archives. New detectives joined the force who'd never heard of Zoe Harris. The neighborhood on Talleyrand Drive saw families move in and move out. The children who'd been Zoe's age when she disappeared were now teenagers. And then, in September 2000, 9 years after Zoe vanished, something happened. It started with a routine DNA sample. In New Jersey, a girl had been found. She was approximately 11 years old, living with a woman who claimed to be her mother. But something didn't add up. The girl didn't have a birth certificate. She wasn't registered in any school system. She had no medical records. When social services became involved, they took a DNA sample as part of trying to establish her identity. That sample was entered into the National Missing Persons Database, a database that had been created in the late 1990s and was now being populated with DNA profiles from old cases, including the DNA profile of Zoe Harris, taken from a hair sample that had been preserved from her hairbrush back in 1991. On a quiet September morning in 2000, an alert sounded in a federal lab in Philadelphia. 2 investigators froze the moment a missing child identifier flashed on the screen. The DNA sample from the unidentified girl in New Jersey was a perfect match to Zoe Harris. The case that had been cold for 9 years suddenly came roaring back to life. Detective Sarah Donnelly had been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years. She'd worked dozens of cases, solving some, leaving others frustratingly open. When the notification came through about the Zoe Harris DNA match, she pulled the file immediately. It was thick, filled with reports and witness statements and photographs from 1991. She read through everything carefully, understanding that this was no longer just a missing child case. This was potentially a recovery. This was potentially justice. Donnelly immediately contacted New Jersey authorities. She needed to see the girl. She needed to confirm that this DNA match was accurate. She needed to understand what had happened over the past 9 years. The coordination between Delaware and New Jersey law enforcement moved quickly. Within 24 hours, Donnelly was on her way to New Jersey with a team of officers. They'd prepared carefully. They had photographs of Zoe from 1991. They had information about her distinctive features: a small birthmark on her left shoulder, a tiny scar on her knee from falling on the sidewalk when she was 18 months old. When Donnelly arrived at the New Jersey Department of Child Services, she was led to a small interview room. And there, sitting quietly at a table, was a girl. She was thin, with long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her eyes were downcast, and she seemed nervous, scared even. Donnelly introduced herself gently. She explained that she was there to help. She asked the girl some basic questions. "What's your name? How old are you?" the girl answered in a quiet voice. She said her name was Amy. She said she was 11, but she wasn't completely sure. She said she lived with her mother, but there was uncertainty in her voice, as if she didn't quite believe what she was saying. Donnelly asked if she could see the girl's shoulder. The girl hesitated, then nodded. She pulled her shirt aside slightly, revealing a small birthmark on her left shoulder. The exact same birthmark described in Zoe Harris's medical records. Donnelly's heart was pounding. She asked about the scar on her knee. The girl pulled up her pant leg, showing a small, faded scar. Again, matching Zoe's records exactly. But Donnelly needed more confirmation. She showed the girl photographs of Laura and Michael Harris. "Do you recognize these people?" The girl stared at the photos for a long time. Her face showed confusion, maybe some distant recognition, but she shook her head. "I don't know," she said quietly. That wasn't surprising. She'd been 2 years old when she was taken. 9 years had passed. Memory from that age would be virtually non-existent. But the DNA didn't lie, and the physical markers didn't lie. This girl was Zoe Harris. The woman who had been living with the girl, the one claiming to be her mother, was immediately taken into custody. Her name was Patricia Glenwood. She was 53 years old, unemployed, living in a small apartment in a rundown neighborhood in Camden, New Jersey. When questioned, she gave contradictory stories. First, she claimed the girl was her biological daughter. When presented with the DNA evidence proving that was impossible, she changed her story. She said she'd adopted the girl privately, though she had no adoption papers. Then she claimed she'd taken the girl in as a favor to a friend who couldn't care for her. Each story fell apart under scrutiny. Finally, after hours of interrogation, Patricia Glenwood broke down and admitted the truth. She had taken Zoe Harris from the front yard in Wilmington, Delaware, in September 1991. The confession was both a relief and a horror. Relief because they finally had answers. Horror because of what those answers revealed. Patricia Glenwood had been unable to have children of her own. She'd suffered multiple miscarriages and had become obsessed with the idea of having a daughter. She'd seen Laura Harris with Zoe in the neighborhood several times. She'd been visiting someone in the area and had noticed the small family. She'd become fixated on Zoe. She'd started driving through the neighborhood regularly, watching the house, observing the routine. On that September morning, she'd been parked at the end of the street when she saw Laura take Zoe outside. She'd watched. She'd waited. And when Laura went inside to answer the phone, Patricia saw her opportunity. She'd driven to the house, gotten out of her car, opened the gate, and lifted Zoe out of the stroller. Zoe had started to cry, but Patricia had quickly covered her mouth and carried her to the car. She'd driven away immediately, heading toward New Jersey. By the time the first police units arrived at the Harris house, she was already 50 miles away. She'd dyed Zoe's hair. She'd told Zoe that she was her mother now. She'd moved from place to place over the years, never staying anywhere long enough for people to ask too many questions. She'd kept Zoe isolated, not allowing her to go to school or make friends. She'd told Zoe that her real parents hadn't wanted her, that she'd rescued her from a bad situation. For 9 years, Zoe Harris had lived under the name Amy Glenwood, believing that Patricia was her mother, having no memory of Laura and Michael or the house on Talleyrand Drive. When Detective Donnelly contacted Laura and Michael Harris with the news, their reactions were overwhelming. Laura collapsed, sobbing with relief and joy and disbelief. Michael couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was being told. Their daughter was alive. After 9 years, she was alive. But the reunion was not simple. Zoe, who still thought of herself as Amy, had no memory of her parents. When Laura and Michael flew to New Jersey to see her, she looked at them as strangers. Laura reached out to hug her daughter, and Zoe flinched away. She'd been told for 9 years that these people didn't want her. She'd been told that Patricia was the only one who cared. The psychological damage was profound. Zoe had been essentially brainwashed, She'd lived in isolation for 9 years. She had no education beyond what Patricia had sporadically provided. She had no social skills. She was frightened and confused and didn't understand what was happening. The reunification process would take months. Psychologists worked with Zoe to help her understand the truth, that Laura and Michael were her real parents, that Patricia Glenwood had kidnapped her, that everything she'd been told was a lie. Slowly, painfully, Zoe began to remember fragments from her early childhood. The house, the front yard, a stuffed rabbit. Her memories were vague and dreamlike, but they were there. And gradually, she began to accept that Laura and Michael were her parents. Patricia Glenwood was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and a host of other crimes. She showed little remorse. In court, she claimed she'd loved Zoe and had given her a good life. She claimed she'd saved her from neglectful parents, though there was no evidence of any such neglect. The prosecution argued that she was delusional, that she'd ruined multiple lives because of her obsession. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in prison. She would be nearly 100 years old before she was eligible for parole. For the Harris family, the recovery of their daughter was both a miracle and a tragedy. They had her back, but she was not the same child who had disappeared. She was 11 years old, traumatized, confused, and struggling to adapt to a completely new life. Laura left her teaching job to focus entirely on helping Zoe readjust. Michael worked extra hours to pay for therapy and counseling. The neighborhood on Talleyrand Drive welcomed Zoe home, but the celebration was muted. Everyone understood that this was not a simple happy ending. This was a family trying to rebuild after 9 years of devastation. Zoe struggled in school. She was years behind her peers academically. She had trouble making friends because she didn't understand basic social interactions. She had nightmares. She had panic attacks. The therapist said it would take years, maybe decades, for her to fully process what had happened to her. But slowly, she made progress. She began to bond with Laura and Michael. She began to call them Mom and Dad without hesitation. She started to smile more. She made a friend at school. She joined a soccer team. Small steps, but they were steps forward. Detective Sarah Donnelly attended the sentencing hearing for Patricia Glenwood. She sat in the courtroom and listened to the impact statements from Laura and Michael. She listened to Zoe's therapist describe the psychological damage, and she thought about all the cold cases in her files, all the families still waiting for answers. This case had a resolution, but it wasn't the ending anyone would have wanted. Zoe Harris had been found alive, but 9 years of her life had been stolen. 9 years she would never get back. As Donnelly left the courthouse, she thought about the morning in 2000 when that DNA alert had come through. The moment that changed everything for the Harris family. The moment that brought Zoe home. But she also thought about all the cases that didn't have that moment. All the children who were still missing. All the families still searching. She returned to her office and pulled out another cold case file. Because the work never ended. Because there were always more cases. Always more families waiting for answers. The Zoe Harris case became a landmark in the use of DNA databases for solving cold cases. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, even when cases seemed hopeless. It showed that advances in technology could bring resolution to cases that had been dormant for years. But more than that, it reminded everyone that behind every case file, every statistic, every news report, there was a real family. Real people whose lives had been shattered by violence and loss. The case of Zoe Harris was not just about forensic evidence and investigative technique. It was about a mother who answered a phone call and lost her daughter. It was about a father who blamed himself for not being there. It was about a little girl who had her entire life stolen from her. Today, Zoe Harris is in her early 30s. She's worked hard to build a life for herself. She completed her education. She went to college. She's managed to form healthy relationships despite the trauma of her childhood. She speaks occasionally about her experience, hoping to help other survivors of kidnapping and families of missing children. She's also become an advocate for stronger laws around child protection and better resources for investigating missing persons cases. She works with organizations that support families of missing children, understanding better than anyone what those families are going through. Laura and Michael Harris remained on Talleyrand Drive for several more years before eventually moving to a different neighborhood. The memories of that house were too painful, even with Zoe back. They wanted a fresh start, a place where they could build new memories without the shadow of that September morning. The case also had a broader impact on law enforcement procedures. It led to improvements in how quickly child abduction cases were handled. It contributed to the development of better communication systems between different law enforcement jurisdictions. It emphasized the importance of DNA databases and the preservation of evidence in cold cases. Detective Clarence Doyle, who led the initial investigation, retired from the Delaware State Police in 2005. He kept the photograph of Zoe Harris that had been on his desk for all those years. He later said that finding out she was alive was one of the best moments of his career, even though he wasn't the one who ultimately solved the case. Detective Sarah Donnelly continued working cold cases for another decade before eventually taking a position training new detectives in investigative techniques. She always used the Zoe Harris case as an example in her training, not just because of how it was solved, but because of what it represented. Hope, persistence, the importance of never giving up on a case, no matter how much time has passed. Patricia Glenwood remains in prison. She's given several interviews over the years, each time claiming she did nothing wrong, that she gave Zoe a loving home. Mental health professionals who have evaluated her believe she suffers from a delusional disorder and is unable to recognize the damage she caused. The green sedan that multiple witnesses saw in September 1991 was eventually identified through Patricia Glenwood's confession. It was a 1987 Toyota Camry that she'd been driving at the time. By the time she was arrested in 2000, she no longer had the vehicle. It had been sold years earlier and could never be recovered for forensic analysis. The beige fiber found on Zoe's stroller was later matched to a jacket that Patricia Glenwood had owned in 1991. She'd disposed of the jacket years before her arrest, but photographs showed her wearing it, and the fiber analysis was consistent with the material and color. The case raised questions about how Patricia Glenwood was able to keep Zoe hidden for 9 years. How did she avoid authorities? How did Zoe never encounter anyone who questioned who she was? The answers were disturbing. Patricia had moved frequently, always paying rent in cash, never staying anywhere long enough to draw attention. She kept Zoe isolated, not allowing her to leave the apartment except for brief trips to the store, always supervised. She told neighbors that Zoe was homeschooled due to health problems. In the years before the internet was widespread, before social media made it harder to disappear, it was possible to live under the radar if you were careful. Patricia had been careful. She'd avoided situations where Zoe would need to provide identification or documentation. She'd never taken her to a doctor unless absolutely necessary, and when she did, she'd used fake names and paid in cash. It was only in 2000, when Zoe was 11 and getting harder to control, that Patricia made the mistake of taking her to a hospital for a serious illness. The hospital required more information than Patricia was comfortable providing. Social services became involved, and that's what ultimately led to the DNA sample that broke the case open. The psychological impact on Zoe was the subject of several academic studies. How does a child recover from being kidnapped and raised by their abductor? How do they reconcile their memories and experiences with the truth of what happened? The answer is that recovery is possible, But it's a long and difficult process that requires extensive therapy and support. Zoe has said in interviews that she sometimes struggles with conflicting emotions. For 9 years, Patricia was the only mother she knew. Even knowing intellectually that Patricia kidnapped her, part of her still has memories of being cared for, of not being harmed. It's confusing and painful to process those feelings. But she's also clear about one thing. What Patricia did was wrong. Kidnapping a child, isolating them from the world, lying to them about their identity. It's not love. It's control. It's abuse. And she's worked hard to make sure other people understand that. The Zoe Harris case reminds us that missing children cases are never truly closed until they're solved. That families never stop hoping, that investigators never stop working, and that sometimes, against all odds, miracles do happen. But it also reminds us of the cost, the years that were stolen from Zoe, the trauma that she still carries, the pain that Laura and Michael endured, the fact that even when a missing child is found, even when they're returned safely, the story doesn't have a simple happy ending. There's healing, there's rebuilding, there's moving forward, but there's also permanent damage that can never be fully undone. As we close this case, it's important to remember that there are still thousands of missing children, thousands of families still searching, thousands of cases still unsolved. The work continues. The search continues. Because every child deserves to come home. Every family deserves answers. And if there's one thing the case of Zoe Harris teaches us, it's that we can never give up hope. Even when a case seems impossible, even when years have passed, even when all the leads have dried up. Because somewhere, somehow, there might be a breakthrough. There might be a DNA match. There might be a witness who finally comes forward. Justice may be delayed, but it's not denied. If this case has moved you, if you believe in the power of never giving up on the missing, then do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button for the Cold Case Desk. Ring the notification bell so you never miss when we cover another case that demands justice. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Zoe's story, or tell us about another cold case you think deserves attention. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, and who knows, maybe one of our videos will be the one that generates the tip that solves a case. Share this video. Let's make sure that cases like Zoe Harris's are never forgotten. Because at the Cold Case Desk, we don't just tell stories. We keep hope alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.